So I will just start with a short introduction. As we all know, audiovisual archives have been conceived in different contexts, and they function differently through their own socio-political and financial contexts. The dominant discourse within the archival community has been constructed based on the experiences of European and North American film archives, rather the archives of the global North. And unfortunately, practices and realities of film archiving in other parts of the world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, have been neglected too often. Of course, there have historically been some efforts within the FIAF to include the Global South film heritage also, notably a group which focused on relations with archives in developing countries in the 1970s, and which was sometimes also assimilated to a FIAF commission. But also some discussions in the 1990s on the identity of FIAF and whether FIAF should accept archives from other geographical parts of the world. And also some newer initiatives such as the Real Emergency. But these initiatives were mostly one-sided, where FIAF or Europe, let's say, the global North, intended to help archives in developing countries. What we would like to propose in this roundtable is to deconstruct this view and valorize the multiple ways through which archives function, different strategic models that they have developed corresponding to their own realities and means, and also try to move towards a multi-sided dialogue and collaboration between global archives. So, in order to embrace the global film heritage, it is indeed necessary to include the cases of the archives of the Global South and also their ways of archiving in our discussions. This becomes a pressing matter when it comes to digitization and digital access possibilities of film heritage, as the one-sided view leads to the invisibility of a large part of global film heritage. But as the archival community, we are responsible for film heritage from all over the world. And if the collections of the Global South are neglected, endangered, or lost, we have failed in our task. The flow of practices and knowledge between archives should prove crucial for the benefit of the whole archival community. And this roundtable attempts to offer a glimpse of the global audiovisual archiving landscape in this direction. So now I have the pleasure to introduce our participants. I will start with Juana Suarez, who is a professor at New York University Tisch School of Arts. She is the director of Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Program there, and she's a specialist of cinema and audiovisual archiving in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next, we have with us Abubakar Sanogo, who's also a professor of film studies at the University of Carleton in Canada. He's researching African cinemas and archiving, and is currently also working on African Film Heritage Project, a partnership between Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers and the Film Foundation. Then we have Karan Chan, who's the executive director of Asian Film Archive, a film archive based in Singapore and dedicated to South Asian cinemas. The archive collects, preserves, and presents films from this region, namely countries such as Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And last but not least, we have with us Giovanna Fossati, the chief curator of iFilm Museum and professor of film heritage and digital film culture at University of Amsterdam, who is at the origin of the idea of this roundtable. So now we can get to the questions. First of all, I would like to ask our participants to reflect on how archives in different parts of the world have conceived their own strategies and practices for digitization and digital access. It would be interesting to give an overview of the situation, the strategies, the policies, the means of different archives faced with the digital turn. but also their ongoing projects. What are the priorities? Who's in charge of digitization? What goal is pursued? And how is digital access provided to film heritage? Let's see where we stand. So we will start maybe with Juana. Could you please talk about the situation of Latin American film archives faced with the digital turn?
So before I start, I would like to thank the Museum and the organizers and my colleagues for this wonderful possibility. These exchanges are always welcome. I also would like to acknowledge that I am speaking today from the campus of NYU, and that NYU settles in ancestral Lenape homelands, and we recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Lenape nations past and present, and these acknowledgements are very important for the historical awareness of indigenous exclusion and erasure, and is critically important, and we are committed to working to overcome the effects in our own educational institutions, mostly keeping in mind that New York City has the largest urban native population in the United States. Because I don't work for Latin American archives, I also want to disclaim that whatever comment I do positive, and particularly the negatives, I'm not speaking on behalf of the archives. They have their own agency, and I do this with due respect for the hard work that colleagues do in Latin America, in many instances against the odds. So I think that this question on who is in charge, what is the goal that we are pursuing with digitization? Like everywhere else, the goal is to preserve materials and to be able to give access. How that is done, I think, is different in the 33 countries that are considered part of Latin America. That will include the Francophone and the Anglophone countries. I only work in the geographies that speak Spanish and Portuguese, and I wish I had the funding and the bandwidth to expand to the other countries. So I think that Latin America has a history of what I call major archives. Those are mostly the state-funded institutions that have like independent mission statements, and they usually respond to the grand receipt of the nation. They are in charge of taking care of the glorious heritage, like big cinematic industries. But there are also an amazing number of minor archives that are nested in universities, that are nested in museums, that are hidden collections, that are at university archives. And there's also a lot of emerging archives because society is always in flux. I am originally from Colombia. Last week, I was consulted by a group of exiles in Amsterdam, how they can create a digital archive for the political upheaval that we are witnessing right now, and the amount of social media and the flux of information. So that you have to consider the balance between those major and minor forces. So when we say also that states are funded by the state, it doesn't really mean that they are well funded. And I think that for technological purposes, for digitization purposes, there is an imperative of technological structure that we lack, and that makes it very difficult to do short-term and long-term planning. So if we were to look at numbers, and I'm only talking about archives, I'm not talking about post-production companies that are offering archival services now, that like they had found a hub of services to offer. I might be mistaken, but the last time that I counted, only 6 archives in Latin America have film scanners now. And not all of them are big archives, major archives. Some of those scanners are, for example, one of them is at the Cinemateca Brasileira, and that scanner was inactive even before the crisis of the Cinemateca. There is another one that was recently bought by the Fluminense University, and that's a small archive. There is only one in Puerto Rico. So when we talk about the Caribbean basin, there is only one film scanner that was recently acquired by the General Archive. And Puerto Rico, of course, also has this very particular thing of being, for us, part of Latin America, but is part of the states, is a state of the United States. So that complicates the things. So, and then there are things, for example, like a Frankenstein scanner that the Uruguayans handled to revamp from a telecine that was sized by a bank to a post-production company, was given to the Universidad de la República archive, and they happened to revamp that into a 4K scanner. So I'm just pointing at this only with film. I'm not even going to talk about magnetic media racks, but the answer is never homogeneous. Of course, everybody is invested in standards and best practices, but when you don't have enough funding, it's very difficult to plan. We are buying the scanner, we are digitizing this to 5 years, and this is the digital preservation plan that we are creating, and this is the digital storage we are paying for. So the fact that money comes in little amounts, and that this is also pretty much tied to how governments conceive culture and the role of archives within the landscape of culture is very difficult, because you do have a lot of people that have gained a lot of expertise and training in AV archiving in Latin America, but those are not necessarily the people that are leading the archives. And I would say that the pandemic, that the processes are very uneven, and the pandemic made it very relevant, the need for digital content, because the organizations that were able to survive are the ones that have been able to digitize assets.
Thank you very much, Fana. So yeah, I think Abubakar, you can also see some similarities in the problems of infrastructure that Fana mentioned, also with regards to the film archiving in Africa.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you for inviting me and all of us to take part in this fantastic conversation. Timely, indispensable. I agree with one. I mean, I think in many ways, of course, every situation is specific, but there are resonances. And for us, I think an important dimension to take into account is, first of all, the way in which, again, like one, I'm not speaking on behalf of any archive. I'm an academic, not an archivist. But I'm part of the largest filmmakers organization in Africa called the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers. And we've launched a kind of continent-wide archival project trying to draw synergies from all the 54, 55 African countries. And so one of the issues is obviously how we came to the archival table. I think it's good to start there. For us, of course, I don't know, you know, the history of African cinema, at least 65 years of global film history took part in Africa, finding a colonized Africa, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So for 65 years, we're not officially able, at least, to take part in those conversations, period. Okay, then that means, of course, that the film archival movement of the 30s and 40s was, at least for us, as far as I'm concerned, primarily a European affair. And it may be argued even today, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, that to a large extent we are talking really, for better or worse, about G8 archiving, if I can call it so, broadly speaking, Global North G8 archiving. And so arriving at the table late means that the vocabulary, the technology, the infrastructure, etc., were all developed without taking our context into account. And so I feel like there are at least two ages of the global archiving, at least audiovisual / moving image archival movement. I think the first age, I would say, was, let's say, the first writings of Matuszewski down to the FIA project, etc., till, let's say, the late 20th century. Let's put it that way. It was sort of the European narrative, Euro-American narrative of the archive. I feel that the 21st century should really inaugurate a second age, which is as you term it, the global South narrative of the archive, and I feel that we should sort of flip things upside down in a way that would really try to think about the archive by taking the global South as the point of departure, not just let's add it to the conversation, etc., but really, if let's say the Langlois and others were born in Brazil, in Ghana, and in Iran, what would they be doing? How would they be imagining the future of archiving in the world today? That to me is the most interesting question to ask, frankly. And if we do that, I think we might have some chance to get somewhere. So just to come back to at least to the specific African situation, I think, like Wanam said, I think we have, obviously, we are not in a terra nullius, as we say. There are archivists across the continent. People have been trained over the years, etc. National archives, every country in Africa has a national archive. And so you have professional archivists who did library and archive studies, etc. They know the work. Most often they are not also trained in audiovisual or film. That's one of the limitations. That's one. And so part of the battle is really to actually have the National Archive take into account the question of the cinema. That said, we do have, in fact, some National Archives that have, in fact, audiovisual assets. For example, I'm discussing a lot these days with the National Archive of Zimbabwe, for example, and we're trying to develop a kind of project around really creating some synergies in the Southern African region, for example, in collaboration with UNESCO. And I should add, you mentioned our partnership. We have our third partner, in addition to the Film Foundation, is UNESCO. And that's really, really, really important to add. So we may have to revisit that question. So we obviously have specific moving image archives. I don't know, again, you can go all the way from Algeria, there's the very famous mythical Algerian Cinematheque that's been around since the end of the beginning of independence, 1962, 63, 4, and that had those mythical figures. Everybody went there. Godard, Medhondos, and Ben, everybody, Wim Wenders, everybody went through the Algerian Cinematheque. You have that tradition that exists on the continent. You have, of course, other cinematheques, for example, another interesting one in Mozambique, for example, where you had really fantastic documentary experiments that were linked to Latin America, to the New Wave, to Jean Rouge and Glauber Rocha, and so on and so forth. Rui Guerra, who was part of the Cinema Novo movement, and so on and so forth. So we have that tradition as well. So in other words, the situation is really highly complex, but again, in most cases, with a couple of exceptions, the question of underfunding that one had raised clearly applied. The question of infrastructure clearly applies. The question of human resources clearly applies, etc., etc. So in terms, therefore, of so that would be a second case. And of course, increasingly, we are now obviously in a condition where we have the digital turn as well in African cinema, and so most of the work that's coming out is a diginative set of work, and that means that the problem there, the digital, as archivists know, or the debates around FIAF and so on, we know that the digital is not the end all and be all of preservation, etc. And the question of how do we preserve this diginative cinema is a head scratcher, I know, for everybody. And so for us as well, we have Nollywood, which is a giant thing that produces between 1,500 to 2,000 films a year. How do you even begin to talk about preserving that? It's a sort of massive headache as far as Africa is concerned. So that's another aspect to keep in mind. But some efforts are taking place. I think one of the most interesting experiments, of course, that I've seen so far is the Algerian Cinematheque, which has really started to actually put a lot of their collection online they have through YouTube, through their Facebook page. They're very active, and even through some of the, let's say, non-filmic documents, for example, some of the meetings, the photographs, the statements, the quotes, very, very dynamic. I hope more will follow in their lead. But again, the question is always budget. Many of these archives just don't have a budget. Even one of the most important, let's say the Ouagadougou Cinematheque, which was created by the filmmakers in 1989 and launched in 1995 to coincide with the centenary of cinema. Well, the state Burkina government gives them hardly any budget to function. So they have issues of temperature control and all those issues of cataloging, etc. So Marali, if you gave me permission to share my, I'll show you some examples of how things work there in some way. So there are really huge challenge. It's not for lack of a desire to do things. In fact, if the means were commensurate, we would have the most well-functioning archive on the planet if we could. But again, funding is an issue. Human resources, training, and so on and so forth are really, really, really major challenges across the continent.
I think we can summarize that actually with the delay that African archival movement had in the beginning, now they have to face all these challenges plus the challenges of the digital era all together right now. It makes it even more complicated.
That's right. That's right. And so I don't know if my time is up or if I can add one or two more words, because with our projects, obviously, and I think it's important. You mentioned the one that I was involved in. So we are really trying to do different things within FEPASI. I mean, again, in some cases, we intervene in individual countries. Sometimes it's important for an archive to have support from outside. And so as a continental body, we can sort of help at least just collaborate in terms of enabling certain things. For example, sometimes we write to the ministries of cultures to make it possible for, let's say, a cinematheque to come into existence. For example, the Tunisian Cinematheque, we're on their site, for example, at those very early stages around 2017. In other cases, as I said, we're trying to create regional dynamics. We've tried to create within the context of the equivalent of the EU, we have something called the African Union, a cinema commission in which we integrate issues of archiving. We're obviously debating, of course, with FIAF as well about the fact that our archive is a diaspora. So a lot of it is outside of our continent, and that is a very, very big problem. And so we we're involved in that. You mentioned the African Film Heritage Project, which is a restoration project that we're doing in partnership with the Film Foundation and UNESCO and the Cineteca di Bologna, etc. We've been restoring a number of films. We're trying to create discourse around the archive. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to do at once. And so policy, involving policy, training, restoration, curation, I'll just maybe end there, because one of our big victories was to make sure that at the most important film festival on the continent, there is a section now, a parallel section devoted to film heritage. I think that we're very proud of. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Abubakar. And I think we can continue with Karen. You and your archive, you have been involved in preservation and digitization of several Southeast Asian films. Could you share with us your insights on the film heritage archiving situation in Southeast Asia?
Right. Thank you. Before I start, just to thank everyone, for this opportunity, actually, and I'm really honored that we could be on this panel together with all of you. I suppose I come with a double hat, representing the Asian Film Archive, that sort of we are attempting to archive films that are not already archived or Asian films that are not already archived in their home country or by any other country within the other archives. But I also am representing, as president of SIPAVA, which is the Southeast Asia Pacific Audiovisual Archives, Southeast Asia Pacific Audiovisual Archives Association. And so I think when we look at the Asian continent as the largest continent, it's a very disparate sort of setup, right, in terms of what's being archived. So obviously we have in East Asia archives that have a lot more funding and have a lot more resources to put together materials from their heritage. And in Southeast Asia, where Singapore and where the AFA is based, we have a little bit more diverse kind of setups amongst the different archives. So basically, there are some archives that have no means to actually put even, you know, create an environment for their material, versus other archives that have a lot more funding and are able to sort of, I suppose, build on what materials might already be present within the country. But I think in the last 16 years that I've been with the AFA, we've noticed that with the digital sort of format coming in, archives have been sort of set back by some of these technological changes. So the irony of it is that Asia is really where technology reigns, you know, very much supreme. And yet I think we're struggling to, I suppose, bring this technology into the archival world, and to do it in a way that sort of makes sense for us to sustain ourselves. And I think that's what the Asian archives, in whatever sort of context that we're in, are struggling with. There are some archives that have gone on to just forgo any standards. As long as we are able to archive something, it's better than losing it completely. And so we've actually gone on this basis that, you know, we will help whoever is able to just give us whatever material that they have on hand. It doesn't have to be the best, and it definitely does not have to be the highest resolution. So it has come to a point whereby I think the struggle is to just save as much as we can in the best way that we know how. And I think every archive and different sort of little associations that have come up within the various countries are actually trying to do their best at that. That said, it does lead to a lot of duplication. And this is where I think archives that countries that have more resources can step in to actually say, you know, this particular materials are things that we have already preserved. You've got to concentrate on things that we aren't able to help with. So this is where the AFA comes in. We try to gather materials that we think and we know will not be put on any priority in their home country. So if it is, for instance, not within their mandate, or it has been banned for some reason, this is where then the AFA comes in to provide that home. Because, you know, I suppose governments change and powers change, and, you know, it's our kind of responsibility to archive and keep this heritage in a way that, you know, many years down the road, it will become available once again. And so I guess with Asia, we're facing a step whereby people are chasing the technology to actually kind of save what is being preserved or what is being produced now in terms of the digital format. But because we're also losing all of our analog material, whether it be in film or magnetic material, we're losing that in a way whereby I think people just haven't have the money or the space to keep them. And so it's kind of like losing on both fronts to that extent, right? So I guess it's quite similar to what Juana and Abu Bakr have described in Latin America and Africa. But I think Asia possibly is benefiting from the dichotomy of both the more well-established and more well-funded archives that are attempting to reach out to those that are not as able to. And so in a way, there has been some ability to save material that we once thought, we might lose, but it's almost like trying to, I guess, utilize whatever that other archives may have to be able to reach those that are not able to contribute, I suppose, towards their own heritage. So I guess I'm going to guess in the few questions later on, I'll be able to illustrate this a bit better, but I think I'll stop here so that we can move on a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, you raised several points which are very interesting, and I hope that we will have the time to come back to all of them in the next questions. So now, for now, I would like to just say that what you have said, the three of you, we have seen a lot of different views and models of archiving which have been established all around the world. And so my question for Giovanna is that how do you think that these models in the global south, they contradict or not the established frameworks of European film archives with regards to practices such as preservation and access?
Yeah, thank you, Maral. And again, first of all, thank you all for participating to this roundtable conversation. And thank you, Maral, for moderating it. Also, in my case, I have a disclaimer. I speak, with two hats. My hat as a chief curator at iFilm Museum, where I've been for 25 years now, and my hat as a researcher who has focused in the past 20 years mainly on the situation of European archives and North American archives. So I cannot really talk for all European and North American archives. There are huge differences within Europe, also geographical differences. The Northern archives are traditionally better off, let's put it this way, than Southern archives. And there is also a big difference between institutional archives, smaller community archives, and all kind of archival, audiovisual archival initiatives that are also arising lately and are very welcome, but they make the panorama even more varied. What I'd like to respond to this kind of global mapping of problems and how kind of shifting to a more global approach to audiovisual archival concerns, how it relates to what I know the Western situation is. Well, it plays on three levels: the political, the curatorial, and the technological. I mean, even more complex than that, but let's look at those. On a political level, I think that there are strategies in place, especially in Europe, especially in the funding system that we know in most European countries, that really are based on rhetoric that archives have built on about long-term preservation of archives of high standard, and this has led to improving the situation of many archives. Many of the European archives didn't have proper facilities 30 years ago, and building on this rhetoric with the funding entities, now they are in a better situation. But it is a tricky way to defend archives, because it's very much based, and now I move on to the curatorial level, to what has been and is still the dominant curatorial approach, which is based on concept as film as art, film as monuments. So we need the funding because we are safeguarding the Rembrandts, the Vermeers, to make some Dutch references, of film history. So it's a very, it's a strategy very much based at the high end of audiovisual archives and film archives, very much Western centered, very much auteur based. And this is changing. I mean, we are changing. We don't believe in that anymore, but the kind of rhetoric that we use with the funding entities is still based on that. The other side of that dominant curatorial approach is also playing with the nationalistic. So we are mainly focusing on national film heritage. And although we are all playing with it, here at iFilm Museum, we always say we are saving a Dutch film culture and not Dutch films. So we can have more flexibility in what is Dutch film culture. But even there is a very national driven curatorial approach that places Dutch or national film production as the main core, which is problematic because these nations are changing. I mean, Amsterdam, 70% of people living in Amsterdam are not native Dutch, if we can define that. So it's not anymore a real reflection of the Dutch society to focus on Dutch films. And on top of that, the fact that we focus mainly on films that are released in cinema. And of course, we also consider experimental, but still there is a very quite old school definition of what is the main focus. So I think the political, the curatorial, and finally the technological, that is again based on the film as an art, so high end, is we need to approach the technology change with the highest standard. So we look at Hollywood standards and we talk about 2K, 4K, you name it, and everything has to be approached at that level, which is really on the long run unsustainable and probably undesirable. So there is a problem there in the long-standing rhetoric most institutional archives are based on, and the fear of losing funding if we put this rhetoric in crisis. That said, I think we've come to a point that we need to rediscuss this. It's really needed. We cannot only focus on European auteurs and the few non-European auteurs that come in through festivals. There is much more. And finally, also thanks to technology, we can see it. I mean, it's only the tip of the iceberg, but everybody can see that there is a film history that goes beyond the canonical one. I mean, it's not only a prerogative of the film scholar to know that. Everybody knows. So there will be, and there is already, and there will be a growing expectation from audiences to see these global audiovisual archives, to to move on from that Western-centered accessibility to audiovisual heritage. So I think this is the big challenge for Western archives, and I think it's a challenge that we have to take, because it's only going to get better if we do.
Yes, I definitely agree with you as well, and it also allows me to go back to another question, which is related to that. That if you are changing our views, and if you are trying to become more inclusive, both in terms of archival collaborations, but also the film heritage itself, I think we will have a lot of we will see a lot of benefits for everybody in it. And so my question is, how may an exchange of knowledge and experiences between archives contribute to a more enhanced preservation and access of global film heritage? So for example, I'm thinking about Latin America, because I don't know, Juana, maybe you can tell us if there are already some collaboration networks between Latin American archives, and if there are some similarities and differences between the socio-political situations in those countries, which can be sources of mutual knowledge between them.
Thank you, Oral. I love that question, because it allows me to remind people that agency has already been enacted by communities in Latin America. Communities are not like passive spectators waiting for the support. I think that was like a very colonialist approach that also happened in yesteryears, where Europeans and Americans always traveled with the know-how. No, that has been eradicated. I think that, for example, the internet, the social media has provided spaces for people to get organized. And there's a presentation that I do about what is going in Latin America that has like a large showcase of initiatives, groups that had gotten together in Facebook with all the problems that Facebook may have, and of course with all the challenges, because every time that we put something in social media or on our website, we have to be doing web archiving, and we also have to be attentive to the metadata that is being generated by using these digital platforms, same as when we buy digital products. But I would say that at the level of networks and communication, there is a wide array of initiatives between local archives and between countries. So of course, the benefit is the possibility to discuss common specific issues and challenges, and the possibility to advance projects, processes, and the possibility to advocate for resources and training. So there are associations of archivists in different countries. Argentina, for example, and Brazil had very solid associations of archivists, and in many cases this is not only the case of Brazil, is really they have ABBA, is an association of people that are working in audiovisual preservation. In other associations is just a chapter of audiovisual within association of archives. There are government systems also to keep archivists connected. That's the case of the CIPAC in Colombia, which is not only is patrimony in general. And then you have cases, for example, in Uruguay. If you look at Montevideo, Montevideo is a city of 1,700,000 inhabitants. They have something called Mesa Interinstitutional Table that groups the archives of the city. So I think that there are like all these collaborations. The CLIME, which is the Council of Latin American Moving Images that reports to the FIAF, has tried to be a little bit more active in the last 3 years. Still, they need like a big, I don't know, like a big impetus, like when you're riding a bike and somebody pushes you from behind, and then you can go faster. And there are very well organized initiatives in places such as Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has something called Archired. It will be like Archired, and they recently received a Melon grant that allowed for the purchase of a scanner for the General Archive, and their inclusion of AB archives is very recent. Our NYU Audiovisual Preservation Exchange, APEX, is supporting that initiative. And then there is more flux of collaborations now with IASA, IFTA, FIAT. The next Congress of IASA is going to take place at Señal Memoria in Colombia. So I think that that change of location is also important, that we don't see places only at places where we have to go and help. That's very colonial and instruct, but how we devise systems where knowledge is transferred in a less colonial way. I think it's very important to underline the word that RIDPASA, that's RIDPASA, which is the Ibero-American Network for Digital Preservation of Sound and Image Archives. That's based at the UNAM. They are doing a wonderful job in consulting, in webinars, in training for all Latin America. It's very well received. But we also have to keep in mind, for example, that there are places that cannot even afford to have a website. So they totally rely on social media, and social media, as we know these days, also needs a social media manager and a generator of content for social media. I do want to close with something that I think is important, is that I think that the partnerships that we can think of have to be thought from a less vertical perspective. They have to include local knowledge, and they have to cater to specific needs. That's still something that is important, and we have to create more funding opportunities and training on how to apply to that funding. Sometimes, for example, applying to grants in English is very difficult for institutions because they don't have proofreaders, and there is a lot of lingo that is local to English-speaking countries or any language spoken in Europe that doesn't translate really well on like what is it that you mean. But I wanted to remark on something, and this is no criticism, it's just an example. I recently supported a Latin American institution in its effort for an international grant. One of the requirements of that funding opportunity was the creation of sustainability metadata in English. We applied because the collection is endangered, because we have no money, but the requirements, but a requirement like this one, asking an institution that in addition to everything the place has to do, the place has to create metadata in English because the collection is going to live in a repository in the States, and I am not going to name names, creates a huge burden for archives that are not, and this is important because these are archives that in many cases, they had not even had funding to sort out reparative descriptive practices and metadata standards that apply to the assets of their cities and constituencies. And I am particularly pointing out to indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities. We have not done that work in Latin America of reparative description and reparative cataloging and creating software and systems of classification that honor, respect, and include these systems of knowledge that are not necessarily westernized. They might be colonized. It doesn't mean that they have been totally westernized. So even if it comes with goodwill to support, these kind of requirements becomes very ineffective. So I want to close with this very specific statement. The global can be negative, be effective if it is homogenizing and if it gives no room for the particularities of the local.
Yes, great statement. I think this can summarize perfectly well what we are trying to do here with this roundtable. And yeah, so about what you said, I think also it joins also what Karen said before about the so the archives, they are doing what they can with the means that they can, and also the knowledge of their own region, what can be done actually in their own regions. And so this allows me to ask the next question to Karen as well. So what do you think, because you talked about Seapava, and which has very different archives from Australia to India with very different means. So how do these different voices interact together, and particularly how does Asian Film Archive fit into this heterogeneous network?
I think SIPAVA, when it first started out 25 years ago, was really, in a way, I suppose, an association that brought together people who were like-minded, but had no ability to work on their own at that point in time. And so they relied on each other's sort of know-how, as well as the kind of, I suppose, training that each other could provide to neighboring countries. Over the years, we found that the various archives are facing different problems, not because they are different, but because the collections have become different in that, right? And every country sort of production has grown differently as well, and every archive is discovering new things that require a different kind of attention. So I think countries like Australia, New Zealand, even Taiwan, Korea, for instance, and Japan, naturally, all have the kind of expertise that they are now sharing with the countries that form and are part of SIPAVA. And what's really heartening, I think, is that we've now kind of brought the expertise that we've developed in Asia to other countries that we would need it. So for instance, the Pacific nations that come under SIPAVA's sort of ambit as well are now receiving the help that we once received from other countries that were able to train or even provide, you know, sort of the kind of technological advancement just for us to be able to find our own way. That said, there are a lot of national boundaries, right? And archives, I think, generally by nature are relatively territorial when it comes to what belongs to them. And I think this is where AFA and the differs, because when we're transnational and we were built or formed with that in mind. And I think our initial and formative years, when we broached this to the region, people found it baffling as to how do you create an archive that doesn't or isn't bound by a national sort of mandate, right? And who supports you, and where would you get your funding from? How exactly would you sustain yourself over time? I think I fought with that question for all of the years, and I continue to do that. But one thing that we knew was that we needed to find the synergy between us as a sort of institution looking at Asian cinema with the countries that we knew are also struggling to find themselves or find the means to help their own sort of heritage, right? To sort of preserve their own heritage. So what has come about is an interesting sort of working relationship. We tell the archives, if you know of filmmakers whom you are unable to help, but you think would be willing to let us help them, meaning that their films would travel out of the country to us, then we'll make that connection. And so a lot of archives have made that connection between AFA and filmmakers within their country, so that if we could actually sort of come together to help those filmmakers, right? So it's a very, in a way, a relationship that is symbiotic to that extent. We try not to step into those national sort of boundaries, I suppose. And we're sensitive to that. But at the same time, we're also recognizing that a lot of what we do is apolitical. I do not own the rights, neither do we, attempt to take over anything, and everything continues to belong to the rights owners. I guess where we're coming from is just for saving the film for a posterity. And I think people then ask us, how then do you sustain that? What funding would you get to, work towards that? And I think what's been interesting is that we've found synergy with the National Library of Singapore, whereby Singapore is placed geographically and politically and economically within Asia in a way that we're sort of connected in ways beyond, just the what the eye can see. And I think we're very aware that saving that heritage is saving ours as well. And so that kind of mindset, I think, has at least saved us, or at least has sustained us for the last 60 years. I'm just hoping it will be for another 60, right? Like that sort of, I suppose, willingness to share would be where we would be going with the kind of work that we're doing as well. And I guess that's where SIPAPA comes in, because that's where the nations are trying to help each other. And I think that sort of willingness to just be able to help has really enabled a lot of the different countries to set up at least some sort of mechanism to work within their own country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these transnational links, they also exist very, they're also very present in Africa, regarding the African film heritage, which is very regularly regrouped and treated in Pan-African institutions. So how is that beneficial to African film heritage, do you think, Abu Bakr?
In many ways. In fact, now it's important to clarify the fact that although we tend to lump Africa under, many African countries under the label of Africa, that we really have distinct situation in each country. That is the point of departure of the conversation, right? So the second, though, is that in spite of these differences, we, in fact, one of the things that allows us, I think that's one of the founding heritage and legacies of our political struggles, is really that the founders of independent Africa and even beyond have given us the legacy of Pan-Africanism, the ideology of Pan-Africanism. And the idea is that there's this desire and a need to feel solidarity with Africans anywhere they are on this planet, in whatever condition they are, and to assist in transforming their situation if they are in difficulty. So this ideology made possible the fact that when in late 1950s, for example, there were only 4 or 5 independent African countries, they committed that the independence would be meaningless unless all the continent was free. And they set up to help through funding, through training. They welcomed Mandela in Algeria, in Tanzania, in Zambia. You see, that's legacy is really part and parcel of the history of the continent. And so the political legacy also has a cultural dimension to it. It was also through that we were able to create institutions like FESPACO, for example, or the African Cinematheque of Ouagadougou, or even the Carthage Film Festival. And so those are really the springs on which now issues of the transnational and linkages and so on, the African Film Heritage Project, these are the legacies on which we are now able, if you will, to build synergies between different countries, because we take that for granted now. Of course, the national exists, the national laws, etc., etc. And so I'm very inspired by what Karen was saying about what the Asian Film Archive is doing, because there's a kind of extraterritorial mode of archiving, so to speak, that is very, very interesting in that way, right? So we, therefore, I would say that the two examples that I heard, I mean, there's, I think, a bit ahead of us, certainly in terms of institutionalization of this desire, but we could go very fast if things align and if we are organized in a particular way. And so we're trying to also create a kind of set of association of film archives across the continent. There's already a couple of institutions, though. For example, there's something called the ESARBICA, the Eastern and Southern African region, let's say branches of the International Council of Archive, ICA, right? So that really has all of East and Southern Africa, which is really a significant number of countries who meet and exchange around various archival issues, including the cinema, for example. That's been around since, in fact, the 1960s, for example. Right. And so there is that. What we're trying to do at Repass is precisely to sort of multiply that, and also perhaps not only make it around the question of the National Archive, but articulate it with community archives, independent archives, and so on and so forth. So multiply that in many ways, and really, therefore, again, engage in some of the practice that I've heard, so that, you know, there's a discrepancy between, let's say, levels of affluence of archive, right? So it's obvious that maybe, let's say, the Algerian or the South African archive is slightly more affluent than the Ouagadougou archive, for example. So or the Moroccan archive, I mean, one example of regional collaboration. So, for example, there was a flood at the Ouagadougou archive in 2009, for example. And so in order to really do some of the repairs on the film, they transferred a lot of them to Morocco. Right. And so they did the repair, and some of the stuff stayed there. So you have some Burkina Faso archive in Morocco today. You have also some of the archives that the Malians repatriated from Yugoslavia. Some are also in Morocco. So we're trying to create those kinds of synergies to really, really bring, you know, just build from the expertise that's already there, and then multiply cost cutting and so on and so forth. Because as I said at the beginning, the technology was not created with Africa in mind, with the reality of Africa in mind. And so the next front, I would say, I suppose the question is coming later, but the question of sustainability would mean that we have to be able to imagine 4K technology that's affordable to every single country on this planet. Otherwise, I don't see the point, right? That we have to be able to imagine preservation, infrastructure, etc., that's affordable to every citizen who is interested in becoming an archivist. That, to me, seems to be some of the frontiers of the way forward. Again, because, as you know, industrially speaking, the colonial division of labor was very clear. Raw material from colonized countries, processing in colonizing countries. The cinema took the same route. Post-production, shoot your film in your country, post-production in Europe. At least for the history of Africa, that's really the case. So when we want to restore films, we can't go and find any negative in our country. We have to go to Paris, to London, to Berlin, and so on and so forth. So these are part of the issue, and so we have to sort of turn the clock around a little bit on that front.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think we've seen with your different examples how beneficial it can be to collaborate between archives based on their realities as well. And so, Giovanna, you were talking before about the necessity of changing our Eurocentric vision. And so my question was that, what do you think is the biggest challenge to, if you want to include the social political diversity of global film heritage, what do you think would be the biggest challenge?
I think there are a number of challenges. I think, well, first of all, we all have to agree, and I'm sure we agree about that here and also within our community, but in a more broader way, that that a misrepresentation of our global audiovisual heritage in the digital space is undesirable. We kind of need to all agree that having saving only heritage produced, or films and audiovisual products produced in certain area of the world without a broader representation of all global audiovisual archive is undesirable, that it's not something to work towards. Then agree that we have all to learn from each other. So that it's not a matter of we have more better means, knowledge, so we'll help countries in need, but we can learn from each other. And I do think we can learn from each other. I do think when I see my younger colleagues, my students, they do have the ideal that the heritage they eventually want to work for should be diverse, should be global. So they already have that urge, so they already know that they can learn from heritage that should be preserved and somewhere else. Something else that Juana mentioned about the local and the community archives, and what I think there is a lot to learn from there. So I think that in Europe, where there is a mainly institutional approach to archiving in general and audiovisual archiving as well, there is a lot to learn from models that rely also on community work. And I see it's already happening. Younger generation are also working in that ways, and I think institutions should really learn from that. So, and also in terms of methods, because again, these high standard 2K, 4K, the best you can have approach, it's not sustainable, not even for Northern archives, from richer archives. So they'll have to rethink methods. And I think this can be an interesting global discourse on how to rethink these methods. Again, the challenges are that we rely on a system that has been long-standing with certain networks. So the national networks, the Dutch has some, but I'm pretty sure every country had similar ones. The European, the Association of Cinémathèque Européenne, ACE, FIAF, of course, Fiat, even AMIA. They are, they all do very interesting things, but they are still not offering the model we need. So we need to work on an alternative way of collaboration, where you don't end up sitting at the table always with the usual suspects, a number of archives you've already worked with and collaborated with on a big restoration that will be screened next summer in Bologna or in Pordenone or somewhere else. So I think each archive of course, also on a network level, but I think each archive will need to add this ambition, this new task to their policies. So not only once in a while have a collaboration with the Indonesian Film Center for restoring one Indonesian title, as we did a couple of years ago with but have a structural collaboration with Indonesia, especially relevant for the Netherlands with a big Indonesian community and Suriname community, have structural collaborations with this country and based on true exchange, because we believe that offering a diverse programming in the theaters, curated selection of films on the streaming platforms is something that it's important and beneficial. So we'll have to change the way we collaborate. And again, habit and relying on existing systems and networks, it's a big challenge in its own. I'm very optimistic because I see many new younger colleagues joining the archives with different ideals. So I'm pretty sure it will change, but we'll all have to work in that direction.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. And I think it's a very good point to discuss, maybe just very briefly in a few words, sustainability, which I think everybody has mentioned. So maybe the thing is that when we are carrying out digitization, restoration, and other archival practices, we mostly benefit from punctual financial means or technological means. And so, but the thing is that we need to develop more sustainable strategies to be able to continue from now on. So my question to everybody is to reflect on past experiences and also future perspectives in this regard. And yeah, let's start with Juana.
There's a lot that has been already said here that is basic for that, for sustainability. I think Abubakar, the emphasis of Abubakar on budget, funding is absolutely important. And I also think that what Karen is saying about how sometimes we're just like surviving, our archives are just like surviving, digitizing to keep a project alive, that creates a lot of work because we are doing the things halfway and eventually we will have to do them again to keep standards. And that's one issue, because these standards created by European associations, by the Library of Congress in the States, etc., are also designed for well-endowed institutions. So I also want to underline, of course, that the constant political unrest in the case of Latin America is an obstacle. You cannot talk about sustainability without assessing the challenges. The political unrest, the lack of autonomy in decisions. Now, I'm talking about the cultural sector. Big part of Latin American culture depends on ministries of culture that are extremely political and that are a little bit to the whim of whoever is in government, whether it is Republican, conservative, liberal, whatever is the political party. So there's something that I would like to underline, that we can always see, we can speak endlessly about deterioration of material, obsolescence. There is, of course, a problem because cinematic legacies die, and because we are unable to access those archives, materials become difficult to acquire. Documentary makers, creators, researchers, students had to rely on whatever is available, usually in platforms such as YouTube, and usually in very low resolution of materials that already deletes the aesthetical discussion on how materials were created. So I think that the audiovisual content is important, but I would like to underline something that is impossible to overlook if we are going to talk about sustainability, and is the human factor. Now, is human beings. we're not at a stage in which things in archives are only done by machines. So very recently in my presentation for AMIA, I talk about, for example, the consequences of the Cinemateca Brasileira crisis and the Centro Técnico de Audiovisual in Rio for the employees, because I did an anonymous survey and the level of lack of hope, a sense of the end of a career, of a profession, the inability to plan for the future that other countries can afford, getting pregnant, adopting a child, having a dog, having a good life, etc., is impossible for many people that work in these archives. And so many of those employees, and this, of course, we know the crisis of the Cinemateca Brasileira, but this is also a common characteristic in archives in Latin America. People work per contract, and people have to pay for their health insurance, and people have to pay for their retirement plan. It's not, in many cases, offered by the archive or the institution that is hiring. In the cases of places like Brazil, of course, they are caught in the middle of a pandemic and a very inefficient government that is on top of everything, ultra-right government. So it's also very detrimental when in places like Brazil, directors of archives had been replaced by dentists and actors. And a lot of people that are trained to do the job as directors and archivists are relegated to a second place. So I think that we can highlight that case, but low wages, lack of rewards to develop for professional development, lack of oral history projects that record the wisdom of those who were working in archives before the field was institutionalized, employees that don't get compensated for their efforts that they are doing to train themselves, is causing not only an exodus, I am part of that, to another country. I did try to come back to my country after NYU MEAP. I already had a PhD when I came to NYU. I did the MA and I tried to come back to my country, but I was not offered a good job. And a lot of people are doing a job that I feel that I could have done better and work a little bit more in a community approach and also be a little bit like the catalyzer for many of these initiatives that do not happen in Latin America. And I am not complaining about my job at NYU. I love it. So that's because I also see a lot of the things that Giovanna is mentioning, a new generation of archivists that want the things to be done in another way. But I do think it's important that to consider that the exodus is not only to another country, it's exodus to another profession. A lot of people are just leaving to do another thing. And so there are two things that I want to remark about sustainability, because I am a big defender of looking at the local models. I think that the training in audiovisual preservation should be at least an introduction course, mandatory in filmmaking and in cinema courses, so that people understand the complexities of the archive. There are places like Brazil where this is already happening at the Fluminense University, which is our apex partner. And also I think that producers have to be trained on preservation, because if you budget for filmmaking, you should be budgeting for preserving the film that you are helping, that you are begetting. No, because otherwise, this is why the films become orphan. People that are working in digital do not think about this, do not think about how my film is going to be able to be watched in 5 or 10 years. And I do think that it is important to bring these professionals. If we want to do a service, Giovanna was mentioning Fiat, was mentioning AMIA. This is something that I have said over and over in AMIA. We need to bring these people not to the international committee and not to the diversity committee. Those committees are important in association, but we are dealing with people that understand nitrate, that understand a small gauge, that understand cataloging, that understand magnetic media. We have to stop relegating international people to that sort of ghettos and fully incorporate them to associations and realize that we might be paying for association fees that are 350. That might be the salary of an employee for 2 months in our countries. So all those disparities have to be considered if we want to talk about sustainability.
Yes, exactly. That's a very important point. I think as we are running a little bit late, I would just like to ask Karen also to reflect on this matter.
I totally agree with what Juana has said, and I think I'll just add one point, and that is on the issue of advocacy. I think at least for in Asia, people, archivists by nature are very behind the scenes. We like to sit behind it all and sort of do our work. I think, but we're the people who know our collections the best, and we know how to present it to the people who are funding us, and touching them in the ways that they would see the urgency and understand why they need to support the kind of work that we do beyond the economics of it, right? And I think if we didn't do this job of trying to advocate for this, and we left it to, say, our politicians, or our other sort of members of the society that doesn't understand what kinds of challenges we're facing, and what kinds of gems we have out there that are yet to be saved, I don't think we can convince people to fund us. And that would be the basic, I think over the last couple of years, I've had to learn that myself, and it's been a very difficult thing to come out and say this to, heads of governments and people who run who hold the purse strings. But really, I think we need to encourage all archivists to be advocates for your own cause. Otherwise, what are we working for?
Exactly. So does anybody want to add something else, just to?
I wanted to add something because I'm very drawn by something that Joanna mentioned, and is this idea that we are taking care of the Vermeers and the Rembrandts of cinema. I think that this idea of the monumentalization of cinematic heritages also has to change now, because I mean, I say this with a lot of respect, but I think that there is a lot of homogenization of the region and a lot of homogenization of cinematic heritages. And there's also something that we can call cultural extractivism. I have my students at this moment, I didn't want them to correct the final paper. No, I just taught a class on Latin American cinema and its archives. And literally we were looking at the seams on how Latin American archives have been constituted, because of course we have like this very westernized thing that we owe something to Buñuel. We owe something to Einstein, who lived in Mexico. Buñuel lived in Mexico. We have to be very proud that Argentina found a complete copy of Metropolis, etc. But we have to offer a counter reading of these things that happen in the history. And also like the case of the Museo del Cine already shows how global our cinematic heritage has always been. We, as Abu Bakr was saying, we had not been producers of cinematic technology. We had been consumers of raw footage. We had been consumers of machines, of cameras, etc. So that already establishes a transnational / global dialectics from the very beginning of the inception of cinema. But there's also this thing that you always talk to cinema scholars or to people that are in cultural studies or similar cases, and they are at dismay at the lack of things being digitized. And most of the times they tell you, you cannot find anything in YouTube. Suddenly, YouTube is like the Hejira, where you have to go and find everything. And this is why I feel that education about how challenging archives are, because there's a tendency to talk about the archive, and the archive is a fetish and a trend right now. Every single conference and every single book that is coming in film archives is something about the archive, decolonizing the archive, glorifying the archive, understanding the archive, revisiting the archive, and programming and curator are exactly the same. The archive, the archive, the archive, the archive. But this imaginary archive that a lot of people are talking about seems to be pristine and organized without understanding the complexities of all the processes of collection management that lead to the existence of that archive. And I also think that that extractivism creates a lot of, it will be probably the same in Asia, and it will be probably the same in Africa. And I would say Asian countries and African countries, to observe the difference, a lot of common places. Magical realism, the three amigos, Cuarón, Del Toro, and Iñárritu, no, González Iñárritu, the golden age of Mexican cinema. So in that exercise of reading cinema at the seams, what we discovered is precisely that there had been a lot of the notion of the film maker and the emphasis of the word maker, the people that had helped build the archive because they have compiled, because they have cataloged, because they have protected, because they have created, is also very important to bring to the forefront. Because otherwise we are perpetuating a very, I don't talk about women directors, and I always take my path away from when they invite me to things on women behind the camera. Now, nobody ever curates something called men behind the camera. No, but this cliche of women behind the camera also translates to indigenous behind the camera, no, Afro descendants behind the camera. If we were going to think on how the labor has been distributed, we will have a more horizontal, less phallocentric, and less patriarchal way to approach archives and its relationship to filmmaking, and hence the relationship to social constituencies that calls for another reading, interpretation, levels of advocacy, and allocation of funding to the archives. So I think that that's the first thing that we kind of have to knock down, that very phallocentric reading that is based on the big Western archive, the big auteurs, and the influence and the repetition of those auteurs in Latin America. Because we can never have, for example, Gutiérrez Alea is great. Gutiérrez Alea is great because he looks like Godard. So those are the readings that I think that we have to counteract.
Yes, great. Abubakar, you wanted also to react?
On the question of sustainability, and I think a number of things are indispensable for me. I think the notion, I think I said it already, of unmooring the whole project of film preservation, safeguarding from, let's say, what I would call the archive industrial complex. Let me put it that way, right? I mean, I think it's important to really separate the two, to be able to reimagine a more approachable, more human archive that put technology at the service of the human, not the human at the service of technology. So we don't have to run every 2 years after a new K, 8K, 12K, 25K, etc., but really something that makes a little more sense. So that, I think I would say, that's one dimension. The second dimension would be, for me, the question, I think it's been raised already, but I would refer to it as archival consciousness. I think the sustainability of the archive lies on archival consciousness. In other words, the archive is too important to be left in the hands of the archivists alone. It's too important to be left into the hand of the academic alone, into the hand of the filmmaker alone. I think it's a societal question because it's about the memory of the making or unmaking or transformation of our identities, of our cultures, and therefore it is a societal problem. It is not really a technical problem. You know, it's not solely the technical, is just one dimension of it. But if you're in the archival world, they make you believe that it's a technical question only or primary. Or financial question primary, but these are all really at the service of the broader question of the articulation of what I call archival consciousness, which is really the idea that the past belongs to all of us and we should be custodians of it. And when it's not taken care of, we have to demonstrate in the street. Why are there not enough technological? Why is technology unaffordable? We have to do R&D to imagine new ways of archiving, more sustainable, more affordable, etc., etc. We're talking about oral history. Are there other technologies to bring to bear? Are there other cultures of the archive? If you take Africa, in some way in the archive of the world, right? The human race, walked for the first time on this continent. You can say that, right? So there's a tradition of archiving, not mechanical, not digital, perhaps, but in terms of preserving the past, talking to the ancestors, etc. These are embedded modes of archiving, and to what extent can these also serve as inspiration for new ways of doing things? I mean, I think this is really, really important to keep in mind as well for sustainability, so that we do not reduce to the archival to the primary form it has been bequeathed unto us from Euro-America, if you will. And I think I think that's it. I think advocacy was mentioned, so make the archive really front and center of people's imaginary, ways of thinking. I mean, 30 years ago, we all lived with our computers and we were all fine. Somehow the computer industrial industry convinced the world that if you don't use a computer, you're illiterate. If you don't use a computer, you can't get a job. And here we are. So we can do the same for the archive, perhaps, right? That if you're not trained into thinking about this way of the past, you are in effect an illiterate. And so, I mean, there's a modes of advocacy, if you will, that could really, I think, the more generalized the problematic is, the more sustainable it will be. Then the technological, the financial, the political, and all these other situations, I think, might in the process be resolved.
I do want to thank that Abubakar mentioned that, because I didn't finish an idea. I actually had my students just doing a little reflection. How does your research advocate for the archive after a whole semester of relying on the archive? No, and I think that that's important. That cultural extractivism will come to an end when we realize our research is a way to advocate, not just to take. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you all very much, and I think we can maybe wrap up here. I think we could have gone on for 3 more hours, but sadly we don't have time, so we're wrapping up here. And I hope that we will see many more discussions like this in the future, and also that we will gradually, one day, we will move towards a more inclusive way of archiving. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.